So I have 2 hours blocked off for the writing and language section of the SAT today. Of course, the writing and language section is a lot shorter than that. In reality, it's only 35 minutes for 44 questions. I blocked off a little bit more time today so that we can go through a full writing and language section and also have time to look at the individual concepts that you really need to know for the SAT writing and language section. So you will notice that every single concept isn't tested in every single writing and language practice test. It will vary from SAT to SAT. So it's really important to take several practice tests and review the concepts that pop up in each one. So in your emails, and let me just post this link in the chat for anyone that did not see this in their email beforehand. So the link that I just shared with you guys has all the practice materials that I'm going to be referencing today. I will also send out a key for the writing and language questions that we will be covering after this workshop is over, so that if you don't have access to a printer or it's difficult for you to keep up, as I move along, you'll have all those answers in my work for them. So for the writing and language section, as I said before, it is 44 questions and only 35 minutes. I think, let me see, I just looked earlier today how many seconds that is per question. That is going to be, let's see, 35 minutes. That can't be right. Yeah, about 47 to 48 seconds per question. I have had a lot of students finish the whole writing and language section of the test in only about 35 minutes to 40 minutes max, which should give you enough time to go back and check any questions that you were a little iffy on. So you're going to see a couple things in your email. The first one is the writing and language core concepts handout. So this is a little bit more in depth than you will see in the core concepts handout that covers the entire SAT. I tried to put it into only one page so it's easy to reference and cover every single topic that you could possibly be tested on an SAT writing and language section. So someone just said, I didn't get the link. The link is in the last chat message right above. Let me resend it. There you go. So this is going to be the main thing that you're going to want to study and reference the day of the SAT or the day before you take the SAT, if you just want a quick little review. The writing and language core concepts handout is not designed to teach you the concepts. It's designed to be a reference for you to quickly review the concepts or just see, do you actually know these things? So this would be a good thing to go through on your own after this workshop today too, with a highlighter or a pen, and just start and highlight any concepts in here that is new to you or that you always struggle with. So let's say dashes seem to be a problem for you, or semicolons. I would start that, highlight it, so you know really to study those. In your email, you should also have this SAT and ACT punctuation and grammar handout. So I didn't make this. This is actually from the Critical Reader. And she designed this handout that encompasses all the concepts that are on both the SAT and ACT grammar sections. So this not only covers each concept, it also explains them in detail and offers examples. So this is a lot longer than that one pager that I just showed you. So this would be better to study from or to use if you're consistently getting a certain type of question wrong in the writing and language section and you need to review that concept. I would go into this handout. So we're going to be looking at both today, but we will mainly be dealing with this larger handout that actually has examples. but I also wanted you to have this one so that you can just quickly review those concepts. We will also be looking at section 2 from practice test 10. And I'm going to be working through these questions with you guys one by one. I quickly want to ask you, if you have access to the chat feature, if you would prefer if I just go right ahead and do these questions with you guys, or do you want me to give you a few minutes for each passage in the writing and language section to attempt the questions on your own, and then we look at them together? So if you vote for me just going through them one by one, say, what could be a type A. So that's option A in the chat, if I'm just going to go through them one by one. Option B will be if you want a little bit of time to work through them on your own, and then we go through them together. We have a little bit of a mix. Let's see here. I think I'm mainly seeing A's here. And let me just put this link again right here, so this will give you access to the documents. Are you guys seeing the link when I put it in the chat? Can you just type yes if you see it there? Okay, so maybe we'll do a little bit of a mix. So we'll do one passage together, and then I'll have you do a passage on your own, and we'll go over them together and see where the time is, and then move forward that way, so that everybody gets a little bit of both. I'll do a little bit of a mix. Okay, so starting today, I just want to look at the writing and language core concepts. So for the writing and language section, there will be certain strategies that you can use that don't really have a ton to do with grammar, that just has to do with how you approach the section. So the first thing, the little box here, is going to be non-grammatical issues for the most part. So this will just be words that you're going to be looking out for and patterns that you're going to be looking out for. And when you see this occur in an answer choice, you're going to be very suspicious of that answer choice. So if I see an answer choice is super long, or it's the longest one there, if it contains words like it, was, being, that's going to be the words down here. If it ends in an ing, I'm going to be really suspicious of those. So it doesn't mean I will never pick an answer choice that is long, or has the word it, or has the word was, or an ing. That's not the case here. If that was the case, it would be so easy to take the writing and language section, right? We could just eliminate all of the long answer choice, eliminate these, and not really understand grammar, and that would defeat the purpose of this section. Instead, I'm going to be suspicious, meaning I'm going to see if any other answer choice could possibly work before I pick an answer choice that has one of these problems. What if I'm purely guessing on a question? So let's say I have no idea what they're looking for. My guess will not be an answer choice that has one of these problems. Any questions on things to avoid from you guys? So this is going to be an important thing to keep in mind for all these questions. Another thing that I just want to say right in the beginning about the writing and language core concepts, the way you want to approach this whole section is as if you are reading an essay in class for a peer editing assignment. So as you are reading the passage, and in case you were wondering, you should read the entire passage. You cannot only read the underlined parts, because they ask you meaning and rhetoric questions. So for those types of questions, you have to understand the context within the passage. So as you read the entire passage, you want to be looking for what could be wrong. The first time that I'm thinking, is this a comma issue? Is this a pronoun issue? is not going to be when I look at the answer choices. That's already a little bit too late. As I am reading along, I am going to be watchful for these issues and think about, oh, this could be a subject-verb agreement problem before I look at the answer choices. If my mind is already thinking in those terms, I'm going to be much more likely to really excel at this section than if I'm only thinking of what could the issue be when I look at the answer choices. The answer choices should kind of be the last step in your whole process for this. So we're gonna avoid certain things. So main parts in here. So rhetoric are going to be questions that a lot of smart students have trouble with. And that means that not so smart students or the average student will also have a lot of trouble with this. So this will be something everybody pretty much struggles with, will be rhetoric questions. So what are those? Those are ones that ask you to add a sentence, remove a sentence, combine sentences. Where should you place a sentence, right, in the passage? And those can be really challenging because they require that you understand the context for the entire passage. So for these, I usually save them for last. So if I am reading a passage and the second question asks me, should I add this sentence? Should I remove this? How do I combine these? I am not qualified yet to make that judgment. I need to finish reading the entire passage so that I have a clear idea of what is the main idea that this author is trying to communicate before I make that judgment call. So don't fall into the trap when you're getting those meaning questions to feel pressure to answer them immediately. Have a method where you're marking questions that you're skipping over, that you can go back to them and answer them when you're more qualified to make that judgment. Commas. So a lot of time you will be able to notice that it's a comma question if all the words in each answer choice is the exact same, but the punctuation is different for each answer choice. When I see, oh, this is asking me about punctuation, it's not really testing me on subject-verb agreement or pronoun usage, I am going to circle all punctuation. So before I decide if I need a comma or a semicolon or a dash in one of the answer choices, I am going to note every piece of punctuation in that sentence so that I can make sure that I'm accounting for all my punctuation. So that's just a little key thing that I want you to keep in mind before we go through these one by one. Picking one. So here we have a couple of word pairs that can be pretty confusing for students. First up, who versus whom. So I like to teach students that who is the active one, who does things. So you're usually going to see who plus a verb. So who, well, let me get a skinnier font here. So who baked the cake, right? Who is responsible for doing something here? Who is baking a cake? Whom you're usually going to see with a preposition. So for whom did you buy, whoops, let me see here. For whom did you buy that gift? You are the one doing the action in the sentence. You bought a gift. Whom is preceded by this preposition right here. So we know we want whom. Whom is lazy in that sentence. It's just going to be receiving a sentence later, receiving a gift later on, but it's not doing any kind of action in this sentence. Whose versus whose is another one. And you may notice that a lot of these sound the same. And that's what makes SAT questions pretty challenging for a lot of students. You cannot rely on which answer choice sounds better. For the super easy questions, if you are a native English speaker, you may be able to get away with it every now and then. But the truth of the matter is that in day-to-day life, we speak incorrectly all the time. So if you are only relying on what sounds best as you read, as you're listening to yourself read out loud in your mind, you are going to miss some easy points. So you want to think about the grammar justification for your answer choices, not just that sounds better than the other answer choice. So whose versus whose, who with a apostrophe s is going to be possessive. So, who with an apostrophe s is going to be who is. So if I have whose like that starting a sentence, it would be who is coming to the party. Whose without the apostrophe s is the possessive one. So whose book is this? So the book here belongs to who, right? Whose book? Then versus then. So then we're going to be using to compare two things. And you want to be very, very careful with SAT questions that contain the word then, because a long time ago, they used to just check for then, if you could tell the difference between then and then. But now they want to get more bang for their buck for each of these questions. So when they test you on then versus then, they generally are also testing to see if you know how to compare like things. And this is getting even trickier on SAT questions lately, because it's not enough to just know you compare apples to apples, people to people, verbs to verbs, that kind of thing. You really want to match the sentence structure for each part of the comparison. And I'm pretty sure we're going to see a question like this today. Match the sentence. Oops, I need a smaller eraser here. Sentence structure. And then you can see here that then relates to time. So that would be a sequence of events. This happened and then that happened. There, there, and there. This is one of the few things that they really teach well in high school grammar, I'm pretty sure of. So there, the first one with the apostrophe is just going to be they are. So they are doing something. The second one without the apostrophe is possessive. So it's going to be their books, their ice cream, their house. And then the last there would be over there. So over beyond the hill or over there down the street. Except versus except, again, these sound the same, right? So it can be kind of confusing. The first one is to receive, and the second one is to exclude. So I accepted an award. I eat all vegetables except carrots. Not a true statement, but you can see how you would use the word except in that sentence. Affect versus effect. This is going to be another one that I feel, if I'm just making up a statistic on the spot, probably 9 out of 10 students that I work with have problems with affect versus effect. It can just be very confusing. So affect is to influence. So that generally would be with emotions or feelings, things that are not permanent. So a movie may have affected me, right? It may have made me sad or happy, but that's not going to be my permanent state for the rest of my life. Effect, I usually think of as to accomplish something. So you can think of the effects of the hurricane or the side effects of a medication. So that is going to be impacting the way the outside world looks or the way that the patient feels, or it could have side effects that are permanent. So that's usually something that's measurable and that's very apparent. It's not going to be changing quickly. I versus me. So I is the subjective, so I is the nominative case and me is the objective case. What does that mean? You do not luckily need to know the difference between nominative and objective case for the SAT, but you should be able to distinguish when you use which one. And we use this incorrectly all the time. So this will probably in day-to-day life and with students, parents, my family, my friends, I just hear this all the time used improperly because we tend to think when we use the word I that we sound smarter, right? So my mother gave my brother and I our Christmas gift. And when you hear that, it probably does not sound terrible to you. My mother gave my brother and I our Christmas gifts. But if I get rid of my brother in this sentence and I just say my brother gave I my Christmas gifts, that doesn't sound that great anymore, right? So it should be my mother gave me my Christmas gifts. So be really careful when picking between I and me, especially if there is an and. Always delete the other part, so or the other person to really see should it be I or me. It's an it's. So our first one here is possessive. With the apostrophe S, it is it is. And then the last one doesn't even exist, but it can be an answer choice, even though it does not exist. So you may have noticed a little pattern here. For each of these that were possessive, so let's just mark these in blue. So whose, and I'm going to make this a little smaller. So whose was possessive, their was possessive, and its was possessive. None of them had an apostrophe, right? So just note that here. So for the possessive one, you are not using an apostrophe unless you have a noun. So if I said Carla's book, I would need an apostrophe. But if I said her book, do you see there? No apostrophe. Oops. Then like versus as. So this one's pretty easy. When you see the options for like and as, you're just not going to pick like if you can pick as instead. So that's an easy elimination one for you. So for the rest of these, I'm going to go in that other document, except for our prepositions. So you can see here, all I tell you for prepositions is that you need to memorize them. And if you don't already know your prepositions, you really need to learn them in order to up your SAT writing and language score. So prepositional phrases do not impact subject and verb agreement. That means when I have a sentence and I see that a verb is underlined, and the underlined portion is what they want you to either leave alone and say no change or correct. The moment I see a verb underlined, I am going to mark off all my prepositional phrases in parentheses. because those prepositional phrases will not impact my subject-verb agreement. And you will see that as we go through some examples in the other document. So I'm going to switch over to the main grammar document. So the nice thing about this is that the grammar rules for the SAT and the ACT are pretty much the exact same. They don't really differ. In my opinion, ACT grammar, that's going to be the English section, is a little bit easier than SAT writing and language or SAT grammar. But they also give you a little bit less time per question, and they give you a lot more questions. So it's up to you to decide which one's a better fit. Some students like that there are a lot more questions because they feel that if they miss a couple, then it doesn't have that big of an impact on their score for that section than when there are fewer questions. But there are other aspects of the ACT that you also have to keep in mind. So it's not just going to be one section makes it or breaks it for you. So another thing to keep in mind for writing and language in the English section for the ACT is that it's the easiest section to increase your score. So out of all the SAT and ACT sections, if you commit to spending, let's say, 2 to 3 hours just learning these rules on your own, and then you work through all the practice materials that are available on the College Board, you should do super well in this section. Most of my students score in the 99th percentile for the grammar sections for the SAT and ACT. So that means they are missing maybe 3 questions. So this will really be the section that I would focus my energy on to begin with, to just collect those easy points and get them out of the way. Because even if you didn't have great grammar when you were in middle school or high school, by using these resources, you can make up for lost time and really learn these rules. So this will be the section where you do not want to give up points. So punctuation. We already talked a little bit about apostrophes. We saw that with our pronouns, right? And here we go. Pronouns do not have apostrophes when they're possessive, like with it. And remember, we saw there also, and some other pronouns earlier. When we use an apostrophe with a noun, we are making the noun possessive. So you use an apostrophe S to make that possessive. I always kind of eliminate the possessive part because usually they don't just test you on one concept at a time for SAT writing and language. Remember how I said earlier, they really want to get the most out of each question. So normally when they're testing you on apostrophes, they are also testing if it's plural or singular. They're going to be looking for 2 things at the same time, and I consider them separately so as to not confuse myself. So here we have the boys' ball. So that's going to be several boys, right? Sharing one ball. The dresses, buttons, again, several dresses with buttons. The children's game, singular, right? The game the children are playing. Let's go on here. So we have it and its. I already kind of covered that. There, there, and there, we looked at already. Whose versus whose we covered. So semicolons and periods. So I teach students that semicolons equals periods. And during a workshop a couple months ago, I had a student raise his hand and he said, oh, semicolons equals periods? Are you sure about that? Is that always true? And I said, of course, it's always true. And he said that for every essay that he's going to write from that point on, he would put a semicolon instead of a period to end his sentences. And of course, that is not true. So we're going to make a note here that don't end sentences with semicolons. But I think that goes without saying. But just in case you wanted to be tempted to take this to a really extreme point, we're not going to end sentences with semicolons. So when do we use semicolons? We're going to use semicolons if we can use a period, and also if we can use a comma and. So usually if we see an answer choices that there's an answer choice for a semicolon, a period, and a comma and, then all of them would be wrong. So this is just a basic multiple choice test taking trick that you can use. So if 3 answer choices are equivalent, then none of them can be the correct answer choice. There's a little bit of an exception here. So I don't think this occurs in the practice test we're going to look at today, but every now and then they have you pick between a semicolon, a period, a comma and a colon. And those are sneaky, sneaky questions. So we're going to look in a little bit of when do you pick a colon, and how is it possible that a colon could be used in place of a semicolon, a period, and a comma and. So we're going to circle back to that in a little bit. So semicolons, we can use them the same way that we use a period between 2 sentences. That means that we need a subject and a verb on both sides of the semicolon. Or you can think about it as each side of the semicolon has to have information that could stand alone as a sentence. So if you have something that starts with, because it was raining outside, that's not a complete sentence, right? Because it was raining outside, what happened? We don't know. It's not a complete thought. So that would be something that cannot stand alone on one side of the semicolon. We also really like semicolons. So remember here, we're dealing with semicolons before conjunctive adverbs. So that is a mouthful. Think about it as semicolons before transitions. So if I have a word like consequently, however, moreover, although, despite, any kind of transition word, smack dab in the middle of a sentence, I'm probably going to need a semicolon right before it. You cannot just put a comma before it by itself or an and. That's not going to be grammatically correct. But you could put a semicolon there because then it's almost as if you're starting a whole new sentence or a whole new thought. So just keep in mind, we're not putting transition words in the middle of a sentence without using a semicolon. So our 2 options when we have those words somewhere in the middle would be either start a new sentence or use a semicolon. Commas. So if we have a coordinating conjunction, so joining 2 full sentences, so subject and verb, and a subject and verb, and we're using a conjunction with that, we're going to need a comma and. So fanboys would be the most common thing that you're going to see. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Out of these, the most common ones on the SAT would probably be and but, and or. And I see some of the time that they really like using so. And back when I was in middle school, high school, which is like way over a decade ago, it's probably like 15 years ago, I was always told, don't use so, because so leads to run-ons. And the SAT just doesn't really agree with that. So every now and then you will see so, a comma so, in a right answer choice. So if you were also subjected to that rule by an English teacher somewhere along your academic career that you shouldn't pick so, just kind of put that to the back of your mind on the SAT because they do like the comma so. It does occur every now and then. So Yeah, there you go. So if you see any of these, you're going to want a comma right before it, like a comma and. And that makes these equivalent to basically a period. You're starting a whole new sentence that can stand alone. You also need a comma between a dependent clause and an independent clause when the dependent clause comes first. Whoa, that's another mouthful, right? So what is a dependent clause? That's going to be something that cannot stand alone, stand on their own. So not a complete sentence. So an incomplete thought, basically. So, and you can see here that a lot of these start with a word that makes you think more information is going to be offered. And in this case, they just abruptly end. So we're going to have a comma after each of these and then more information that follows. So because I went home, after we returned from the movie, when we visited Chicago. And you want to be careful with these two. We're going to look at them a little bit later in this document, but also look for misplaced modifiers for these. So again, the SAT likes testing you on more than one concept at the same time. So when I see a dependent clause and right after that, I see a comma and things are underlined, I'm immediately thinking, oh, could this be a misplaced modifier? Is what came before that comma modifying directly what comes after that comma? So let's see here. Because London is a very old city, it has buildings from many different eras. London was founded around 50 AD when Romans settled on the banks of the Tiber. So you can see here when the dependent clause comes second, so later on in the sentence, you do not need a comma. When it comes first, you do need a comma. The second one is super important, again, for two reasons. So our first one is just going to be for commas. Our second reason is going to be for subject and verb agreement. So a lot of SAT grammar questions deal with subject and verb agreement. You're pretty much guaranteed to see this on the day you take the SAT for real. And when we're looking at subject-verb agreement, I mentioned before that we want to eliminate the prepositional phrases. We also want to eliminate the non-essential phrases when we're looking at subject-verb agreement. So we basically want to eliminate the fluff that comes between the subject and the verb, because they won't just put the subject right before the verb that they're trying to get you to decide if it's singular or plural. They will separate it with a lot of information and make you work for it to figure out what is the subject. So when we look here at this non-essential phrase, London, which is a very old city, has some extremely modern parts. And if I want to verify that this is a non-essential phrase, I can see if the sentence still makes sense. Is it still a complete sentence? When I read it without what's between those two commas. So London has some extremely modern parts. That is still a complete sentence. So now I know this is non-essential. Non-essential doesn't necessarily mean that you don't need it in the sentence. So don't be fooled by that. You can have some important information that is set off as non-essential. It just means grammatically, it's not essential to it being a complete sentence. Something to note here too is we have the word which. And we are going to need a comma, and we're going to go over this again in a little bit. We need a comma with the word which. The only time we're not going to need a comma with the word which is if we have of which or about which. And those are both prepositions. So if we have prepositions right before the word which, we don't use a comma. But if we don't have a preposition right before the word which, we do need that comma. So year 2, if we have transition words smack dab in the middle of a sentence, and we're not starting a new sentence with that transition word. Remember, if we're starting a new sentence, a new idea, a new thought with that transition word, we need either a period before it or a semicolon. But here we're not starting a whole new sentence. So we could also set off that transition word with a pair of commas and make it non-essential, and we can read it without that information and see if it still makes sense. So it does have some very modern parts. That's still a complete sentence. So we don't necessarily need that, however, but it does change the meaning of what we're trying to say. We need commas to separate items in a list. So if I have a series of items, I need a comma between each item. And again, remember, they're testing you on more than one thing for each question as much as possible. So if you see items in a list, we also need to make sure, that they are in the same form. So that you have to something. So to swim, to bike, to shop, and then to do something else. Or I like hiking, biking, swimming, and running. They're all in the same form. So with commas and the word and, in general use, so it's going to be a personal preference whether you use a comma with the word and for the last item in a list. So let's say I said that I packed shirts, shoes, and pants. My personal preference, and on the SAT, you will generally see it, that they put a comma before that and, but according to those who make up grammar rules for the entire world, this comma right here is going to be optional. You can say the sentence without the comma. But on the SAT, like I said, you would generally see a comma right before it. And if two answer choices are grammatically equivalent, they wouldn't make you pick between should you have a comma and or just an and by itself. Note though that you cannot just say I packed shirt, shoes, comma, pants. That would be incorrect. So this is incorrect. But if I redid it over here with a comma and, this is correct. And just with an and would be correct also. This one right here, this next one, would be rarely tested. So it's possible that they will ask you this on an SAT or ACT, but it's not something that I would really think about too much or worry about when studying. So if you can reverse the order of two adjectives, you need to use a comma to separate the order of those adjectives. If the order of the adjectives cannot be reversed, then you don't use a comma. So you could say the groaning, rumbling train or the rumbling, groaning train. So you need a comma before it. If, same thing, let's say let's make up a sentence. I'm terrible at making up sentences on the spot, but I will try one. So let's say the big red house versus the red big house. Could you say it both ways? The big red house, the red big house. You wouldn't really say it the other way, right? You would say the big red house. But you can see they're kind of tricky. So here you would not use a comma to note that it's better to say the big red house. When do you not use commas? So these are important rules to know. You do not use commas on their own to separate two complete sentences. You need a comma and, or other fanboys with the comma to separate two complete sentences. You also generally don't want a comma right before a pronoun. So this right here is a tip-off, the comma it. So be really careful of those. If you just see a comma and then a pronoun, that they are probably telling you there's a comma splice and you either need to replace it with a period or a semicolon or a comma and. Between two clauses with the same subject. So if I have one subject and two verbs, or two verbs and one subject, I don't need a comma. So I like swimming, or let's say, I read a book and wrote an essay. I did two things there, and there is no comma necessary in that sentence. If I said, I read a book and you wrote an essay, now there are two subjects and two verbs, so I would need a comma in that sentence to separate my two complete sentences. Between subjects and verbs, so if you see a comma like this right before a verb, I would go looking first thing to see, are there other commas in the sentence? Because it is possible that there is non-essential information with a pair of commas, and then the comma would be okay right before the verb. But if there is a comma right before that verb, separating the subject from the verb, and there isn't a pair of commas separating non-essential information from the rest of the sentence, that comma is going to be incorrect. So again, like I said earlier, if you have one subject and two verbs, or two subjects and one verb, you do not need a comma. So here, many tourists travel to London and Paris to visit museums and monuments. So here we do not need a comma between museums and monuments. So this, I think, is an SAT favorite, commas before or after a preposition. I think of prepositions as sticky, meaning they don't want to share their space with any other punctuation. So if I see a comma or a semicolon right before a preposition, I'm going to be really careful at examining that sentence to see, do I really need that punctuation? Because the preposition is sticky. It wants to be stuck to whatever words are right next to it and not have a comma to share that space with. So right here, our correct answer choice would be the last one. Frida Kahlo is among the most famous artists of Latin American origin. We do not want a comma right before or after that of, because it's modifying that information, the artist of Latin American origin. So if we put a comma before or after it, it's interrupting the flow of information. You can think of a comma too as a pause. So if you're reading something and the pause is awkward, you probably don't want a comma there. You wouldn't say Frida Kahlo is among the most famous artists of Latin American origin. It's a weird interruption. So that is a trick that you can use if you are a little bit uncertain. Do you need the comma or don't you need it? But again, that relies on you deciding what sounds better, which is not the most reliable method to use. So before or after the word that, you also don't want a comma. Remember, a comma and then which is correct, but a comma and then that is incorrect, okay? In writing, I tend to just use that. If you are ever uncertain, do I need a comma or don't I? When you're writing an essay, just use the word that. Because which, remember, if you have a preposition before which, then no comma. So which can be a little trickier. That, just don't ever use a comma with the word that. So here, don't use a comma between adjectives whose order can be reversed. So the stunning coral reefs, it would be awkward to say the coral stunning reefs. So you don't put a comma there to indicate that the words need to be read in that certain order. Between adjectives and nouns, so stunning coral reefs, you don't need a comma there. You can just say stunning coral reefs. Before an open parentheses. So parentheses also can set up information the way a pair of commas or a pair of dashes can. Be really careful, when you see two types of punctuation right after each other. So if you see a comma and then a parentheses, that's probably not going to be right. If you see a dash and then a parentheses, probably not going to be right. Another thing, I have not seen this tested on the SAT or the ACT really, but just for essay writing, I want to just toss this out here. So when you are ending a sentence, you want a period inside of the quotes if you're quoting information. So period inside of a quote, just as something to know. If you are, how many of you have used Mla Citation for essay writing? Anyone? Just type yes if you have. So for Mla Citation, you want the parentheses inside of the period. So let's say we had a quote, and then we'd have the parentheses and then the period. So this is something that sometimes students struggle with a little bit. But make a note, not tested on the SAT or ACT. Just a little side note. So colons. Colons are used to set up lists and explanations. I think of colons as the mic drop. So it does all the work. It sets it up. So you don't need to use transition words with colons. So no need for transitions. So if you have to set up a quote, you could have an introductory phrase, put the colon there, then end with the quote. If you want to introduce information, again, the colon itself acts as the introduction. So if I said, for instance, and then a colon, that would be really not that great grammar. It would almost be redundant, like saying, for instance, for instance. I could just have the colon by itself, and that says, for instance, or for example. I don't have to have that transition word or phrase there. So remember earlier, I said sometimes, and I think these are some of the most cruel grammar questions, they ask you to pick between a semicolon, a comma and a period, and a colon in the answer choices. And generally, when this happens, you're going to want to pick the colon. Remember, if answer choices are equivalent, then it can't be any of those answer choices because there can only be one right answer. And the colon is pretty much equivalent to a comma and a semicolon and a period if the second part of the information, if what comes after explains what came before. So if you have a subject and verb on both sides of the colon, so that means you have two sides of the sentence that can stand alone on their own, and you're trying to say, can you use a colon there or not? You're going to look at the context. You're going to look at the specific information of what is said, the contextual clues, to see, does the second part, does what comes after the colon further explain what came before the colon? If that is true, then you have to use the colon. It would be grammatically incorrect to use a semicolon, a comma, and or a period. You're going to want to use that colon. So colons can also be used before a list. So if you're listing items, you can use the colon. Note here, we don't say we visited, for example, museums. We just do we visited colon and then drop the list in there. Let's see here. Oh, see, let's actually change the sentence around. On our trip to London, we visited, let's go like this, tourist attractions, colon, museums, palaces, and monuments. Or in the next sentence, on our trip to London, we visited these tourist attractions, museums, palaces, and monuments. Dun, dun, dun. Next one, before an explanation. And here they talk about, I think somewhere in here. The colon is grammatically identical to a period or a semicolon, because the second clause explains the first clause. I hope this is clear to everybody. I think someone asked, what app are you using to write on the documents? I'm using Notability. Notability. You can also use OneNote, but I'm a fan of Notability. Dashes. So dashes can be used the same way that you would use a pair of commas, but you have to be careful. You're not going to have a dash, comma, ever. That would be, whoops, incorrect. But you could have a pair of dashes. So if you have a pair of dashes, it's going to set off the non-essential information, or information that if you read the sentence without what's between the dashes, it's still a sentence. It still makes sense. You could also use a dash the same way as you would a colon. And these are kind of more confusing ways to use dashes, in my opinion. You're not as frequently tested for this. In general, if they give you a list, they would use a colon before it. They could technically put a dash before it, but it's not going to be that common to do that. Some more grammar rules. Redundancy. So redundancy, a way you can avoid picking a redundant answer choice would be to avoid long answer choices. Redundancy on the SAT, so this is going to be harder on the SAT, easier on the ACT questions that deal with redundancy. Redundancy questions on the SAT sometimes have information that was already mentioned earlier in the paragraph. On the ACT, it will be in the exact same sentence, so it's really clear. Even the underlined portion, it's right there. So you'll be able to see this information is repeated. That's what redundant means. The information's already there. For the SAT, sometimes you really have to go look for it. So I generally look, so I'm going to check for redundancy before I say no change. Because a lot of the time it's not that obvious. I think in the questions that we're going to look at today, it's pretty obvious, or you can tell that this is a redundancy issue. But I've seen on a lot of SATs that they really separate the information that's redundant. So they will say, last summer I went to Italy, and then 5 sentences down say, I really enjoyed that pizza I had in Italy, but you already told the reader you're in Italy. But when you're just reading that one sentence, it doesn't sound wrong, and it can be tempting to just say no change, unless you go and search to see, is any information in that sentence repetitive? So here we can see some examples of redundancy. So enormously huge, on a large scale, that's all redundant. Enormous, very large scale. You can just say enormous undertaking, and this is also the shortest answer choice. So just by looking for answer choices using fewer words, you're going to decrease your chances of picking a redundant answer choice. So parallel structure, when you have items in series, you're going to want to make sure that they match in structure. So if you have an ing, you need more ings. If you have the word to preceding it, you need more tos. So you're going to make what is underlined match what is not. So you're going to look for clues in a part of the sentence or paragraph that is not underlined to see what should you change in the underlined portion. Subject-Verb Agreement. So this you can give like 10 stars because it's a guarantee for you for test day. So Subject-Verb Agreement. In order to make these questions a lot easier for yourself, you are going to want to set off the prepositional phrases, eliminate them, cross them out before you pick the verb. So if I look at the sentence here, illegal logging in Mexican forests have resulted in the destruction of the monarch butterfly's habitat. My first thing I'm going to look for is a prepositional phrase. So in Mexican forest, the in is the preposition, and in Mexican forest is my prepositional phrase. I can kind of cross out here, and then I can pick my verb. So illegal logging is singular. So I need a singular verb, which is why has is the right answer choice here. The same thing happens when you have a non-essential phrase separated by a pair of commas. So here we can eliminate our introductory phrase, and then a small insect, whoops, actually here is our comma, and here's our other comma. I need to follow my own advice and look for all the commas. So this whole, a small insect discovered by Cortez in present-day Mexico in 1519. So the cochineal were commonly. So here we can just say was. This is singular. Commonly used. So collective nouns are singular. Each, every, neither are singular. The number is going to be singular, but a number is plural. So another thing to keep in mind is if you have or between two subjects, whichever subject is closer to the verb, so first subject, second subject, whichever subject is closer to the verb is going to determine whether you're using a singular or plural verb when you have the word or. Pronoun agreement. So I kind of see pronouns on SAT and ACT grammar questions as a scavenger hunt because you should always circle your pronouns. Oops, I cannot write pronouns. Why do you need to circle pronouns? Does anybody know why? Can you put in the chat? Why are we circling our pronouns? I have my fingers crossed, at least one of you knows. Why do we circle pronouns? Anybody know? Perfect. We need to know what they are referring to. So the fancy name for this is pronoun antecedent agreement. So we need to make sure that whatever they're referring to, they're going to match in gender and number. So if I am referring to something that's plural, I'm going to use they, right, or them. If I am referring to something that's singular, I'm going to use he, she, or it, depending if it's just an object or a person. Verb tense. So whenever I see a time reference, I'm going to think about my verb tense immediately. What do I mean by that? So if they say in the summer of 1855 or in 2100, I'm thinking, ooh, past tense, future tense, and I'm already looking out for verbs that could be in the wrong tense before I even get to that underlined part. So for verb tense, we are going to make what is underlined match what is not. So we're going to look for clues in that paragraph to see, do we need future tense, past tense, present tense? For present perfect and past perfect, so present perfect is has or have plus the verb. That means an action started in the past and then continues into the present. So Italy and France have been tourist attractions for hundreds of years because they're still tourist attractions. It hasn't stopped. Well, maybe now with current events, they've briefly stopped being tourist attractions. But in general, they have been, right? So it has not stopped. It continues into the present. Past perfect would be when a sentence describes two completed actions in the past, the past perfect can be used to describe the action that came first. Whoa, that's a mouthful, right? So let's look here. Before Mae Jemison became an astronaut, she had studied science for many years. We would say she had studied because that tells the reader that she first studied before she became an astronaut. But because both of those actions are in the past, it can be a little bit confusing. So these two are probably the trickiest questions for the SAT. They're also pretty rare. You're not going to see a ton of these. So I wouldn't spend all your time learning this. I would first make sure you know everything else in the document. And then if you are golden on everything else, you can spend some time really brushing up on past perfect and present perfect. Adjectives and adverbs. If you can add an ly, you must. So let's see here. The girl ran quick. Let's say it just said quick. We could say quickly, so then we must. The top came off sudden. If that was something that you read, you could say the top came off suddenly. And here, it is okay to rely on what it sounds like when you are deciding whether or not to add an ly. So this is probably the only part of SAT grammar that I would say it's okay to rely on, does it sound better, versus relying on an actual grammatical rule. You're using just to compare two things, and then ist is going to be the superlative. So the best, right? The strongest. You will not use another word like more with the comparative. You wouldn't say more stronger. That's going to be redundant pretty much and grammatically incorrect. So we're not going to do that. Word pairs. So word pairs occur together, just like word pairs would indicate, right? So if I have neither, I need to see nor later in that sentence. I cannot say neither or. I can also not say not only just with but. I need not only but also. And as with as. Who, which, and whom. So who and whom, remember, refer to people. And as I said earlier, who does things. So you're going to have who plus a verb for who. And for whom, you're going to usually have a preposition. Modifiers. So misplaced modifiers, remember, will usually be indicated by a comma and then something underlined. So here, born in Mexico City, you would see a little introductory phrase with a comma, and then what comes right after it will be underlined. And usually they have almost like a couple of lines that you need to read through that's underlined. So this can be really reading intensive if you don't immediately recognize it as a modifier question. So here, self-portraits comes right after that comma. So we need to make sure that what came before the comma actually modifies it. So born in Mexico City in 1907, we don't really say that self-portraits are born, right? That does not make sense. So we want a person right after that comma. And if you're able to recognize that right off the bat, you don't even have to read through all of the content for each answer choice, and you can save a lot of time and just energy. I always like students to take the SAT smartly and efficiently, because if you burn out on the writing and language section, that could kind of cost you points in math later on. So the less you can do to get questions right, the less you should do. Misplaced modifiers can also occur in other parts of the sentence. So here, the Great Wall of China, I'm reading right here. The Great Wall of China was constructed by thousands of workers that originally consisted of separated military fortifications. It wasn't the workers, right, that had military fortifications, it was the actual wall. So you want to make sure that that information comes right after the wall. Pronoun case, we already went over this a little bit. So if you are deciding between me and I, just eliminate the other part of the sentence. So last year, my mother and me, you could just say, me attended the gathering of nations. You would not say that, right? So you would just say, I attended. Something to know too with the word between, you're going to use the object case or the objective case. So it would be, let's keep the secret between you and me, because we have the between there. Then for comparison, then for a sequence of events. If you use more or less, you need to use than, because you're comparing things, right, with the more or less. Transitions, we're going to look at a couple of questions dealing with transitions when we look at the section in a minute. And that basically wraps it up. So we went through all 14 pages of this document that all of you should have in your email. I'm going to resend it out once we wrap up this workshop. So if you didn't get it in the first batch of emails, you should get it in the second batch. Super important to study this stuff. Remember, this is going to be the easiest place on the SAT where you can pick up points and really up your score. So spending time in this section can be the difference between getting a really good scholarship and not, right? Sometimes it's just a 10-point, 20-point difference for a student. So you really want to make sure that you know this well. If you guys have any questions before we actually look at a passage together here, you can just type no if you have no questions. That way I know you're still here. Here. Okay, so no questions. Okay, so this first passage I'm going to do with you guys. I'm just going to walk you through it. And then I'm going to give you about 7 minutes to do the next passage. So not a ton of time, but I'm going to give you 7 minutes. I'm going to turn off my video for 7 minutes, set a timer for you guys so you can just see that. And then we'll look at those questions, and then we'll do some more passages together just for the sake of time. So this first passage here, first thing I note is I always want to look at the title. So the title often tells us the main idea of the whole passage. So if I am dealing with a rhetoric question that asks me, should I add information, delete information, what would support the main idea of the passage more, my first thing I'm going to do is look back at the title or look in the first paragraph. But a lot of the time, the title by itself will give you a lot of information. So how a cat in a hat changed children's education. In 1954 Life magazine article, author John Hersey expressed concern that children in the United States were disengaged from learning how to read. Among other problems, Hersey noted the reading material available to grade schoolers had a hard time competing with television, radio, and other media for children's attention. So I see here and is underlined. It doesn't look bad to me already because I can see I have items in a series there. So I'm just going to zoom in on that little piece of information and it looks okay, but I'm still going to check all my answer choices. So answer choice D has an ing and it's kind of long. So if I can pick something shorter, which would be no change, that still looks good to me, it's obeying all the grammar rules, I'm not going to pick something that's wordier and potentially redundant and longer over my concise answer choice. So I'm eliminating D. With, for B, there's already a with here. So that would be redundant to say with again. So I'm going to eliminate B. And then I can pick, so the reading material available to grade schoolers had a hard time competing with television, radio, and also other media. That kind of interrupts the flow, right? Remember, items in a series you want to keep consistent. So this is items in a list. And I'm just going to go with A because it's following my comma rules for that. One solution he proposed was to make children's books more interesting, since an individual's sense of wholeness follows and cannot precede a sense of accomplishment. The writer wants to include a quotation by Hersey that supports the topic of the passage. Which choice best accomplishes this goal? So in general, I would skip this. So skip and come back at the end. But here I already have kind of clues with what's going on. So we're just going to do it as we go along. But I would recommend if you have a hard time with these on practice tests to skip them and come back later. So here he says children's books more interesting. So this is a big clue, this interesting. So it says make them more interesting and all of these start with interesting. So how is he going to make the books more interesting? Answer choice A, the no change, it's not going to make it more interesting with like this wholeness and sense of accomplishment. This is a children's book. So it has to be something that would appeal to children. So we're going to keep that in mind. We want to appeal to children. So B, interesting, since learning starts with failure. The first failure is the beginning of education. That doesn't tell us anything about children. Remember, our main idea is right here in our title, how the cat in a hat changed children's education. So we want to keep that in mind constantly. So this is too general for B, and it's not really going to make it that much more interesting. C, interesting because journalism, wait, we're talking about children's books here, not journalism. So C's out. And then D, with drawings that are imaginative and children's illustrators, that would be more interesting to add drawings. And they directly mention the children's illustrators, and we are dealing with a children's book here, so we can confidently pick D. And 4 questions that deal with rhetoric and meaning, you should have a phrase or a word, some part of the passage that directly supports your answer choice. This should not be just grabbing in the air of like, I feel like this might be it, or I think this could be it. You should be able to say, it's answer choice D, because in the title, he talks about children's education. And he says, makes them more interesting, and drawings would make it more interesting. The story of the Cat in the Hat's publication began when William Spalding, the director, so I see there's a comma, so remember I am circling all my punctuation as I go along to account for everything. The director of the education division at the publishing company, Houghton Mifflin, read Hersey's article and had an idea. So let's see here. We have a pair of commas there. So before I even look at the answer choices, and I would physically just cover up the answer choices and not be tempted to look over there, I am going to kind of cross off what's between those two commas and see if it still makes sense when I read that sentence. So the story of the Cat in the Hat's publication began when William Spalding read Hersey's article and had an idea. That works. So I need the pair of commas. I can't just get rid of a comma. So I already can tell before I look at the answer choices that it's going to be a no change because there's a non-essential phrase there. I also know that if I remove that comma, that's going to create a problem, right, for my non-essential phrase, so it can't be B. Then C moves my comma. Instead of removing it completely, we're just moving the comma, interrupting our non-essential piece of information, so it can't be C. And then D is our rule where we can't have a dash comma. That is wrong, so it can't be D. Let's see here. Okay. Moving on. So Spalding agreed that there was a need for appealing books for beginning readers. He thought he knew who should write one. He arranged to have dinner with Theodore Geisel, who wrote and illustrated children's books under the name Dr. Seuss, and issued him a challenge: write me a story that first graders can't put down. So we want to answer question number 4. So it says, which choice most effectively combines the sentences at the underlined portion? So we need something that's going to be the equivalent of a period, right? And we can immediately think that a period is equal to a semicolon is equal to a comma and. Note that if we're replacing that period with a semicolon, the semicolon by itself would replace the period. We wouldn't need a semicolon with the word and. So here we have a comma and. Let me actually just use a highlighter. So that's great. A dash is not going to be equivalent to that. So B's out. Here we have a semicolon with an and. That's problematic because remember, you could have a comma and or just a semicolon by itself. And then D, we have comma and then meanwhile. So that's going to be a transition word, right? Smack dab in the middle of a sentence. And remember, when we have a transition word smack dab in the middle, we need a semicolon before it, or we need to set it off with commas. So it cannot be D. We're going to go with A here. Moving on to number 5. Which choice best supports the information that follows in the sentence? So this is another meaning / context question or rhetoric. So this could be something that you save for last if you struggle with these. Even if you already feel qualified to answer these. So it's not always going to be skip it because you don't have enough information yet. It could just be skip it because it's going to take you more time to really pick the right answer choice. So remember that. So 1, you may want to skip it because you just don't know yet. Or 2, you may want to skip it because it's going to just take a lot more mental energy. Especially for me, it's going to take more energy for me to pick between A, B, C, or D than to just decide, do I need a comma or do I need a period? That's pretty quick. It's a quick judgment call. Whereas this, you need to read everything. You have to consider every single answer choice. I can't just say, oh, one answer choice looks good, so I'm going to pick that and not read anything else. I need to check every single answer choice because we're looking for our best answer choice. So there could be more than one that kind of looks good, but there's only going to be one that's really the best. So which choice best supports the information that follows in the sentence? Having known Spalding for many years and having maintained a professional relationship with him, Geisel was an experienced writer and illustrator. Okay, let's see what's going on here. It says we need something that supports the information that follows in the sentence. So the information that follows in the sentence is that Geisel was an experienced writer and illustrator. He was experienced. So I need something before that that tells me about his experience. So having known Spalding for many years and having maintained a professional relationship, knowing him for many years, that tells me nothing about is he actually experienced. I want to know about what has he done. So let's find something that tells us he's experienced. So I'm taking out no change. B, acquired a reputation for perfectionism and for setting high standards for his work. That also doesn't tell me anything about his experience. Experience, think about what would be on his resume. Then interested in politics before breaking into the genre of children's lit. Interested in politics? No. Like maybe if they talked about he did something in a political career pertaining to the education of children, that would be something for his experience, but just that he had an interest is not sufficient here. So B and C are both out. And then D, published 9 children's books. So note here our theme that came from the title, that this is about children's education, and having received 3 nominations for the prestigious Caldecott Medal. So here we have his experience. So we can pick D. However, this new project presented him with an obstacle. So the moment I see a contrast word, like however, consequently, although, any kind of transition, I kind of ignore what's given, and I don't look at my answer choices either. I cover them up with my hand, and I decide what is the context. What is the relationship between the information that came before that word and the information that came after? And once I've determined the relationship, then I can easily pick the right transition. If I don't know the relationship between the information that came before and after, I really cannot pick the right transition. So before that, we have having published 9 children's books and having received 3 nominations for the prestigious Caldecott Medal. This new project presented him with an obstacle. Ooh, obstacle. We just talked about he's so experienced and now there's an obstacle. So I immediately see there's a contrast. And if I uncover this, so however is a contrast, but there could be a problem. If I have other answer choices that are equivalent to however, like let's say I see an answer choice that's although or despite, something else that indicates there's a shift, I would reanalyze the information that came before and after to make sure if I identified it correctly. Because just for multiple choice tests, right? If we have 2 answer choices that are equivalent, technically it can't be either of them. So let's say we had for instance and for example, those are going to be hard ones to pick between because it's almost like you're saying the same thing. So however, we like that. We look at the answer choices, for example, would be giving an example, which is not the case. Furthermore, that does not give us that shift there, so we're going to take that out. And then at any rate also doesn't give us that contrast. So there's a shift. So I'm just going to go with A for number 6. Number 7. So on the verge, oh, let's go up actually. So Spalding told Geisel to write his entire book using a restricted vocabulary from an elementary school list of 348 words. Geisel started 2 stories and only to abandon them when he found that he needed to use words that were not on the list. On the verge of giving up, Geisel's story finally hit upon an image that became its basis. So this is where I notice that there is a comma right here. And then there is this whole underlined bit right after the comma. So I am just going to zoom in on the first little part that's underlined and make sure that that is correctly modified by what came before it. So on the verge of giving up Geisel's story. So your story is my subject that's being modified. Can a story give up? Not really, right? So we want a person right after that comma. So when I check those answer choices, the beauty of it is I don't need to read the whole answer choice for either of them. I can just look at the first bit for each one and see which one has the correct information at the beginning. So again, we don't have an image that's on the verge of giving up. Geisel, yes, this is a person, so that works. And then the story doesn't work, right? A story would not be giving up. So I'm just going to pick C for number 7. Let's go onward. So a cat, so Geisel's on the verge of giving up. Geisel finally hit upon the image that became the basis for his story, a cat wearing a battered stovepipe hat. His main character established, Geisel commenced the difficult task of writing a book with a limited vocabulary. At the end of a duration 9 months long. So before looking at those answer choices, we see duration and 9 months. That's going to be redundant. We don't have to say duration and 9 months. So I am immediately eliminating A. After 36 weeks or 9 months, again, I don't have to give it in both weeks and months, so B is out. After a length of 9 months had elapsed. That's kind of weird. And we have length, right? We could just say 9 months. And that's what happens in D. So it's the shortest answer choice, most concise. And it works. Let's go on to the next part. So the book was a hit. Children were entertained by its plot about the antics of a mischievous cat and is captivated. Ooh, children were entertained and captivated. We don't need this is here, which is one of the reasons I am really suspicious of the word is or was on the SAT. So I can just delete the word is here and go on. Its sales inspired another publishing company, Random House, to establish a series for early readers called Beginner Books, which featured works by Geisel and other writers, and other publishers quickly followed suit. In the years that followed, many talented writers and illustrators of children's books imitated Geisel's formula of restricted vocabulary and whimsical artwork. The writer once let's go up here to number 10. So we need to just combine that piece of information there, right? The followed and many. So in the years that followed, cannot stand on its own. That's going to be a dependent clause. Oops. Clause. So we cannot have a comma and or a semicolon right after that. We are going to just need a comma. So we're not going to be able to do a semicolon. We're not going to be able to do a dash. And we also can't have that period there, right? Because in the years that followed, cannot stand on its own. So we're going to go with C. For 11, they say the writer wants a conclusion that restates the main themes of the passage. Which choice best accomplishes that goal? I'm going to go look at the title of my passage. Again, so how a cat in a hat changed children's education. And, but perhaps the best proof of the cat in the hat's success is not its influence on other books, but its limited vocabulary and appealing word choices. I want something that ties it back to children and education. So I'm not, the limited vocabulary and appealing word choices just isn't sufficient for me to support that main idea. So A is out. B, impressive worldwide sales. That also doesn't mention children's education. Enduring ability to delight children. Ooh, finally, we have a reference to children. And engage them in learning how to read. So this works. D, important role in the history of illustration. So that's too broad for D also. So I'm just going to pick C there. So that pretty much wraps it up for the first passage. I'm going to give you guys, let's see, about 45 seconds of questions. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Yeah, I'm going to give you 7 minutes for the next passage, remember to read all of it as you go along. Don't just read the underlined parts, because you will run into trouble for those rhetorical questions that deal with meaning if you are only looking at the grammar questions that are underlined. So I'm going to set a timer, if I can find my timer, for 7 minutes. And then I am going to check in with you when the timer's up. If you have any questions while this timer's going, feel free to add that to the Zoom webinar chat. So we have about 1 minute remaining. Okay, let's get back to looking at the writing and language questions. Let's get back to this passage. So the very first thing you should have noticed is the title says keep student volunteering voluntary. So by reading that, we could infer that this is going to be a criticism of required volunteer hours for college admissions or for certain scholarships before we even start. It always helps to kind of come up with an idea of what you think the passage is going to be about before you start reading so that you can engage more with the passage. This is going to be true in the reading comprehension section also. So here, if we're already thinking they're going to talk about voluntary versus compulsory volunteering hours, we can kind of look for that information that will either support what we're suspecting this is going to be about or conflict with that. But either way, I'm going to pay more attention than if I just start reading this and I'm like a little leaf in the wind, not really knowing where I'm headed. So for answer choice 12, they are referencing this little part here. So when they pick up litter, such volunteering, be it helping at a local animal shelter, comma, something, comma, or working. So I can see I need ing, comma, or ing. And this is the one in the middle here that I need to actually pick. So I don't want a to, I can't just have litter. I need that ing, so it's going to be D. The no change also has that problem where we don't have the ing. And we also have this weird pronoun smack dab in the middle for the no change, which we generally don't like. So number 13, by its very definition, volunteer work is done willingly. And they ask us, the writer wants a transition from the previous paragraph that highlights the criticism of compulsory volunteering mentioned in the previous paragraph. Which choice best accomplishes this goal? So by its very definition, volunteer work is done willingly. The way it is already does this really well. Did I skip over anything? No, I didn't. Yeah. So it already does it really well. Whatever the work may be is kind of vague. For many students, volunteer work is done willingly. That's not really as powerful as saying that the definition of volunteering is something that's done out of your own free will. So we're not going to go with C. And then fortunately for communities in need, doesn't go back to our main idea, our theme, which was our title, keep student volunteering voluntary. So we're just going to go with answer choice A for that one. For number 14, so here we can already see we have two issues going on. We have, is it singular or plural? And also, does it need that apostrophe? So I'm going to look at it separately. So by requiring students to do community service in order to graduate, school officials are taking away students' choice to give up their time for nonprofit activities. Ooh, and I have the same issue here, like a double trouble one. So let's just first think about how many school officials are there. There's probably a bunch. So we want officials to be plural. And then we can also think about, do we need an apostrophe here? So officials are taking away something. If I say football players are missing out on practice, I don't need football players and then an apostrophe, right? It's just our subject. So we don't need an apostrophe there. So any answer choice that has that would be out, and I can see none of the answer choices even have an apostrophe there. So that's another clue that you probably don't want an apostrophe. So A is out. Are taking away students' choice. So how many students do we have? We probably have a bunch, right? This is not just one student. We can also look for a clue earlier in the sentence. Right here we have students, plural. So you can always keep in mind that you're making what is underlined match what is not underlined. So we're not suddenly going to shift from plural students to one student. So I know I want plural students. Answer choice B and D have plural students. So C is out because that's just one student. And then it's student's choice. So here we do need a possessive because we could say it's their choice, right? And remember, there is the possessive pronoun. So we need that apostrophe. So we would say D for number 14. For number 15, proponents of compulsory volunteering who are in favor of it. Ooh, so I immediately see there's an it. And I cross out things that I don't like. You can see that's how I do every single question. And the reason I do that is sometimes every answer choice has things in it that I don't like. This is something that could happen to you. And if you're crossing out the parts or circling, whatever you use, it can be personal to you. If you are annotating it somehow, so it's clear to you what are the parts you didn't like about an answer choice, then it's easier to kind of have a hierarchy of which is worse if there are problems with each answer choice. So if I'm picking between an it and a being, maybe I would pick an answer choice with it before I pick an answer choice with being. So here we have proponents of compulsory volunteering who are in favor of it. This also has an it, and over here we have an it. So if I am rushed for time, I'm going to just see if C, my most concise, shortest answer choice works. So proponents of compulsory volunteering point out that it allows young people to garner the benefits that volunteering offers. That works. So we're just going to go with C here and avoid those really wordy answer choices that put in unnecessary pronouns. Students who volunteer report increased self-esteem, better relationship building skills, and increasingly busy schedules. Which choice provides a supporting example that is most similar to the examples already in the sentence? Well, the examples already there are really positive, right? Increased self-esteem, better relationship building skills. So I want another example that's going to be positive. A closer connection with the community, yes, that is pretty positive. Increasingly busy schedules, that's kind of negative, right? To have a really busy schedule. Less time spent engaging in social activities, that's also negative. And then little increase in academic achievement, that's also going to be negative. So I'm going to go with B, and that fits in more with the other examples there. Let's look at number 17. So this is an effect versus affect. Some studies have also found that students who do community service are more likely to volunteer as adults, and thus effect or affect society positively over the course of many years. You can see here that I was not even swayed by this ing here. I'm not going to pick it, especially if it's the only answer choice with it in it there. So I need to decide, is it to accomplish or to influence? And here it's a positive influence, right? It's a positive affect. So I'm going to go with B. Let's go on to 18. So 18. One recent study by Sarah E. Helms, assistant professor of economics at Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama, did focus specifically on mandatory volunteering. So mandatory would be something that's compulsory, right? It's required. Coercive, our first answer choice here for B, would be using threats or force. We don't generally use threats or force, right, to require someone to volunteer. Forcible is just clearly, let's just write it here, done by force. And imperative means of vital importance. So we are just going to leave it as mandatory, which is answer choice A. I would not ever be tempted to pick an answer choice for a word that you've never heard or you don't know. So don't be tricked into picking an answer choice that you think, well, this works, but I don't understand this word. I've never heard it before. Maybe that's better. Always go with the answer choice that you can clearly see works. The only time I would pick an answer choice with a word that you've never heard before is if you understand all the other answer choices and you know those meanings really well and none of them work. You're like, yeah, I would never pick one of those to put in here. So it has to be the word I don't know. Don't pick that word that you don't know if one of the ones you do know actually works. Let's look at 19. So she found that students who were required to volunteer rushed to complete their service hours in early high school. They then did significantly less regular volunteer work in the 12th grade. So for 19, we have that they there. They then did, right? And we have a subject and a verb on both sides. So we can't just have a comma there. We need something that's like a comma and, or a period, or a semicolon. And I can see answer choice D here has that semicolon. C has a period, but then it puts an awkward comma before then, which we don't need. And B uses a semicolon and it puts an awkward comma after that. Remember that comma is like a pause, and it would be really awkward to have it there. It's separating information. You wouldn't say they then did significantly less regular volunteer work in the 12th grade. 20, we have a comparison because we see the than there. So we have to find what are they comparing. And they're comparing, let's see here. They then did significantly less regular volunteer work than the service hours. We need to compare students to students, right? This they here is the students. So we can't have hours there. So it can't be A or C. But now we have a little bit of an issue. Is it B or D? How many of you picked B? And how many of you picked D? Let's just respond here in the chat. Who picked B and who picked D? Yeah, so this is a little bit of a tricky one. So this is where when we're making things match, and you can like star this one. When we're making things match, we have to match the grammar. We cannot just match like students to students. So D is the most tempting answer choice. But when we look up here, they then did. So we need students did, which is what happens in answer choice B. It's a really sneaky, sneaky question because we're not just comparing students with students, we're also needing to match the tense and the verbs here. So they then did. So we need that did repeated there too. I think that's a pretty mean question, but it's a really good experience for you guys to have now so that you know on the actual SAT to really match up all those parts because they are not just going to test you on do you know then versus than or how to compare apples to apples. They want to make sure that you know it's the right color apple preceded by the right verb, etc., etc. Number 21, which choice most effectively sets up the point made in the next sentence? So let's see what's in the next sentence. Many studies show that when schools simply tell students about opportunities for community service and connect them with organizations that need help, more students volunteer out of their own free will. So instead of requiring students to volunteer, schools have to recognize that not all students are equally well suited to the same activities. Remember our main idea. This is about volunteering should be voluntary. So we need to keep that in mind. This is about volunteering. So it's not going to be A. Participating in athletics and extracurricular activities, that's also not volunteering. So B's out. Should focus on offering arrangements that make volunteering easy and an attractive choice. Yes, that works, but I'm still going to pick D. I'm never just going to stop once I find something that works, because it is possible that more than one thing works, and then I need to evaluate which one's the better answer. So D, are advised to recognize the limits of their ability to influence you. Yeah, we want volunteering, right? So we're going to go with C. And then 22, the writer wants a conclusion that states the main claim of the passage. Which choice best accomplishes this goal? So main claim, what was our main claim? Think back about our title. So our title was keep student volunteering voluntary. So we want something that ties into that. So answer choice A, it is imperative that schools do their part to find volunteers for many worthwhile organizations in the United States. We want something that ties back to the schools, right? Making it voluntary. B, schools that do this will produce more engaged. And what is this, right? This is what came before. So this would be keeping volunteering voluntary. So it's kind of a mouthful. Voluntary, volunteering. Will produce more engaged, enthusiastic volunteers in schools that require volunteer work. That works. Studies in the fields of psychology and economics have revolutionized research. That's not about students volunteering under voluntary guidelines. So C's out. And then students choose things that match their interests and values. That's not it. So B here is the only answer choice that really ties back to the main claim of the passage. So that's what I'm going to pick. So I'm going to just open it up to questions here for the last couple of minutes. See if you guys have any questions before we wrap it up today. I was really hopeful we would make it through the entire practice test, but it's so much to get through. So maybe on another day, we will get through that. I also have other workshops tomorrow and then next Tuesday and Wednesday. I think tomorrow I should know my own workshop schedule, but I do not know my own. I'm pretty sure tomorrow is advanced math. Does anybody know? Can someone confirm if that is what's tomorrow? You can type in the chat. Well, yeah. So tomorrow's advanced math, and then next week we're gonna have a reading workshop and then just a general SAT core concepts workshop. If you've already done a core concepts workshop with me, either at the library or here on Zoom, I wouldn't recommend looking at it again. You can always join if you just want the review and to sit through it, but it's not something that will be as beneficial as if it's your first time. If you guys have time today, if you would go to my website, it's www.carlaberry.com. I have an evaluation on there. Oops. Let me find the actual link to it. This is the actual link. Did you guys get the link? Can you just put yes if you got it? If you can fill it out, if you filled one out in the past, I'd still like to hear from you today to see which parts of the workshop you like the most. If you really like the part where I paused it and I put the timer up and you were able to work through the passage, mention that in there. If you want me to do something differently next time, if you have requests for future workshops, if there was a part you particularly enjoyed or what you'd like me to emphasize more in the future. This really helps me when I plan these workshops for later dates. A lot of how I structure it today is based on what many, many other students before you have told me. So if you can fill that out, that would be great. And that's pretty much it for today. I'm also on Instagram as Carla Berry Prep. I don't post on there as much as I should, but every now and then I hop on. I once did an Instagram story when I only had 2 followers, which I'm pretty proud of, but I have not storied since then. Maybe I will if I can get up the courage. It's kind of hard. Okay, any questions today before we wrap up? You can just type no if you have no questions, then I know it's a no. Okay, great. Well, thank you for joining me today, giving me 2 hours of your afternoon. I hope to see you again for my future workshops. I think these are super fun. I'm going to be sending out a recording of this or uploading it to my YouTube, which is also Carla Berry Prep. Let me actually share my YouTube link here, because the core concepts link is on there. And I will be uploading this to YouTube too. So if you want to rewatch it at all, let me put it here. You can join my 9 subscribers if you would like. So someone asked you and I versus you and me. So when you're picking between you and I versus you and me, let's just take a second here before I wrap up. So you and I would be if they are starting a sentence. So you and I went to Disney. Would you even say that? You and I went to Disney? Someone else also asked. I'll get back to that question. So you and I went to Disney. You could say you went to Disney, and you could say I went to Disney by itself. So that's how I would check it, and that works. So you could say you and I. You and me would generally be, like I said, in the objective case. So that means it would be before a preposition usually. So between you and me, about you and, oh, let me move this. So between, oops, between you and me, about you and me, for you and me, that kind of thing would be you and me. But mainly I would just remember between. I don't think you'd really see the other ones. So just between you and me. Could you clarify further? What if you don't know how broad a question is? What would you do? You give an example of a question that we covered today. My interpretation, just based on that, if I don't know how broad a question is, I would save it for last. So let's see, question number 13. The writer wants to transition from the previous paragraph that highlights a criticism of a question. So you have to use it within the context. Oh, I said B for 13. I meant A. Really? I said B? The answer is A for 13. Oh, you said B? Oh, you said B. Okay. So within the context of the passage, it talks about volunteering and voluntary right up here in the title, which you can already see it's playing on the idea that volunteering, it's in the name, that volunteering should be voluntary. So it makes more sense here that it's just by its very definition. By saying whatever the work may be, volunteer work is done willingly. That's kind of vague, right? Whatever the work may be. That's not even volunteer work. And we're in a volunteering passage. So we really want to make sure that it ties back to that for those types of questions. Any other questions before we wrap up today? Nope. I don't think any other questions. So I'm going to sign off for today. You can also, I'll put my email here, info@carlaberry.co, if you think of anything. And I would really appreciate it if you fill out that survey on my website. Okay, everyone, have a great week. I hope to see you back here tomorrow for the advanced math workshop. Don't tell anyone, but that's pretty much my favorite SAT topic. Some of the questions will be a little bit more advanced than others, but there are some fun tricks to be